Hi, I'm Sabir Liakat, an engineer at Teledyne Princeton Instruments. Welcome to this seminar where we'll cover the basics of LightField automation with Python. In this seminar, we're going to achieve the following goals. Number one, we're going to introduce the library of reference material and sample code that's automatically installed by LightField. Number two, we're going to walk through some sample code that'll demonstrate the fundamentals of operation. Number three, we're going to discuss how to avoid the most common pitfall during automation. And lastly, we're going to demonstrate the use of a software emulated demo camera, which will allow someone to work on an automation project without the need for live camera hardware. So in a situation where one is working from home. Okay, so now let's go through the library of reference material and some sample code that's automatically installed by LightField. So after you do a complete installation of LightField version 6, so our latest version right now is 6.11, it'll install a folder such as this in your desktop. It's called LightField Add-in and Automation SDK. So let's go here, and you'll see that the local directory, let me just get rid of this blue line. Um, the local directory where this is stored in is your C, program data, documents, Princeton Instruments, LightField, Add-in and Automation SDK. So you're always going to find these documents here, provided that you did a complete install of LightField and that you didn't change any directory settings when you did the installation. So the first document you'll absolutely need to check out, and this is something you'll absolutely need to do, is the Introduction to Automating LightField 6 with Python. So let's take a look at this document. So we'll go through the table of contents. So you can see there's an introduction, how to prepare LightField. So this will basically tell you that you're going to need to do the complete install and where to find this information. It'll walk you through building a very simple automation application so you can get a hands-on feel for what's going on. It'll teach you how to refer to the experiment settings help file, which is another document that we'll be covering shortly. And as we walk through the sample code later, you'll see exactly how it's used. And this chapter 5 will just describe some of the sample code that we provide. And this is probably the most important, how to install the Python environment and specifically installing the .NET Python library, which is absolutely a must. So this is absolutely critical. So we're just gonna, let's just scroll down here. So here's the introduction, how to some prerequisites, how to install LightField, how to do a complete installation, and here you can see that as the SDK is installed, you can verify it with that folder on your desktop. That'll show you that you did the complete installation. And if you didn't do the complete installation, this will give you some instruction on how to change that. So this section, it walks you through building a sample automation application, very simple. Um, our developers like using the idle environment. I personally, as you'll see in a minute, I personally like using Spider because I'm used to the Anaconda distribution of Python, which and Spider is one of the environments that lets me see the variables in there like it was in a MATLAB environment. So I personally prefer Spider, but you can use whatever uh, development environment that you wish. So this will walk you through just building a really simple sample application, and we'll actually very shortly walk through one of our sample code just so you can see, what's going on. Chapter 4, as I mentioned, the settings help file. This is going to be very important, and we'll walk through it once again. And here, chapter 5, here's our sample applications, and it'll explain what's going on with some of the sample code that we provide. Like what are the goals and what are the outputs. Um, Installation of Python, this is probably the most important. So you want to walk through all of these just to make sure you install the right version, right environment. You're gonna in this document it tells you to install Python 3.6, and that's actually the version I have on this computer. Now, since the release of this document, Python 3.7 was supported by the Python net library, so you can install 3.7 as well, but if you want, you can go ahead and install 3.6 and copy everything exactly as this document says, and you won't go wrong. And this is exactly why the document recommended 3.6, because you're going to need to install this Python for .NET, the Python net library, and at the time, this was only working with 3.6, and I believe now it works with 3.7. I've tried it out, but you won't go wrong with installing 3.6 Python and this Python net version directed here. So the next document we're going to want to look at, so we can minimize out of, let's just reduce the window size. I want to point out the LightField add-ins and automation programming manual. So let's maximize Acrobat again. Sorry about that. Here's the manual. So this covers in depth how to write add-ins for LightField, but it does have some relevant stuff for automation. So here, especially chapter 7, the programming interface, this will have all of the core methods and the properties. And these are all .NET methods and properties. The automation interface is a .NET connection to the LightField application. And you're gonna need to look at these or reference these when you wanna do different tasks in automation. And these are all the classes, and the classes will have supported methods and properties. So one of the most important classes is experiment. So let's go to this experiment. Just so you can see some of the methods here, and just by their names, you can tell that you're going to need to use these, like acquire, how to start an acquisition. So this method would be like pressing the acquire button from the LightField application. Um, this is the image data set object that's contained in the experiment class, and this object will contain the data information that's relevant um, to whatever you captured. So, if you're doing a one row spectrum, this will be the data set will contain a row of data. If you're doing an image, it'll contain a 2D array, and so on. So this is all very important. So chapter 7 of this add-in and automation programming manual. And again, when we walk through the sample code, you'll see how this will come into play. And thirdly, we're going to go through, I'm going to minimize this LightField experiment settings. So this, again, we're going to walk through it when we cover the sample code. This has the camera settings members, experiment settings members, spectrometer settings members, and just to give you an example of a camera settings member here. So here are some of the settings that you'll need to set um, in this class. So for example, if you want to change the intensifier options here, here's a readout control mode. So you can see an example. You want to do full frame readout, then you want to switch to something like kinetics. You're going to need to use this readout control mode enumeration for the camera settings readout control mode. And again, we're going to walk through the sample code to show you exactly what all this means. And um, we have a bunch of samples that our development team has put together that they get installed with the SDK, and here they are. So in this directory, in the samples folder, you're going to see Python automation. So here is a lot of the sample code. So our next step will be to cover one of these examples. So I'm going to cover this exposure acquire example. So let's go ahead and get this exposure acquire example loaded into a Python developer environment and take it for a spin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my Spider. As I mentioned, that's the development environment that I prefer. So let's let this open. Just give it a minute as it's opening. It's loading the Python console, and now it's opening. Okay. So you can see I have a bunch of scripts here. So the exposure acquire sample has already been loaded. Um, if I wanted to open it, here's what I would do. I would first, the easiest way is just get this Python automation folder. Here it is. just copy that path, and then we're going to open file, and then you can see here, just paste the path, and this is the path to all of the sample code that LightField will install. So here's the ExposureRequire example. I'm going to cancel this because it's already open. So let's walk through this code, and you'll get an idea of what this does. So at first, of course, you have all the declarations. So here to here, these are all just declarations. And for the most part, you're just going to copy paste these, pick and choose what you need between different applications. But the important thing, here's the CLR. This is the .NET class library. Again, this absolutely must be installed. That Python net that's covered in the LightField automation with Python document, that absolutely must be installed. If you get an error when you try to run automation scripts referring to the line that this import is on, then you know that there was a problem installing that. So that needs to be rectified. Um, so past the declarations, let's go ahead and skip these function declarations and come back to them as they're called in the program. So this is what you would say the first line of the program is. So this auto object is going to refer to an automation object that gets constructed with these arguments. So this automation object right here, this is the basis of all the automation. This is the connection port from the Python via .NET to the LightField application. Um, and anything in that connection port is going to be referred to by this variable auto. So this is your connection object right here. The next, we're going to get an experiment object from this auto object. So inside this automation class, there's a LightField application class, and then within that there's an experiment class. So this experiment class will cover, as you may have remembered from when I was scrolling through that document before, a lot of the important things when you want to do an automation project, such as acquisition, experiment loading, things of that nature. So we're going to have an experiment object here. So now we get into one of our functions. We have device found equals true. So let's see what device found is. So this is the definition of the device found function. So it's going to iterate through each device in experiment devices. So what is this experiment devices? Well, we can find out. So here's this document, the add-ins and programming manual. So let's just look up experiment devices. Here it is. See, just Control F. So we'll go to the next entry here. These are the supported properties. So as you can see, experiment devices is a property in the experiment class. And when you get this property, it returns a list. So this will be a .NET list of devices that are currently being used by the current experiment. So what this does is it looks through the devices that are loaded in the experiment window, and if one of them is a camera, it returns true. If there is no camera, then it will return camera not found. Please add a camera and try again, and will return false. So this line, if a camera was detected in the experiment workspace, then we're going to set the exposure time of that camera. So now we go to the set value function. So this set value, which takes the parameters of a setting and a value of that parameter, it'll go through experiment.exists. So exists is another property of the experiment class. We're going to go back to that document. So let's do exists. So there are 7 entries. We're just going to scroll through. Exists. Here. So this is the iExperiment class. It's a Boolean return. The method is called exists. I'm sorry, I might have said it was a property. It's a method. And it'll see if the setting name is actually a real setting. So what this line is trying to tell you is, I'm sorry, it's right here. What this line is trying to tell you is if the setting that was passed into the set value function actually exists for this camera, because not all cameras are going to have all settings. For example, exposure time won't exist on an ICCD. You're going to need to change the gate width on that one, for example. So if the setting exists, then it'll set that value. So let's just take a quick look at set value. It's going to be in the methods of experiment class. So I'm just going to scroll down here. Set value. So here it is. Um, so sets a value by its setting name, and you're just going to need to put in the setting name and the object value. So this line actually changes the setting and commits it in LightField. So, and again, this is going to get the parameters from whatever was defined into the function. So here, so what is this? Camera setting, shutter timing, exposure time, 20. You can probably tell by the name that we're going to be changing the exposure time here. So where do we, how do we verify that? Or if we're going to change another setting, how do we do that? So let's find this exposure time. So we're going to go into now the LightField experiment settings document that I referred to earlier. So here are the camera settings members. Let's just start from scratch. We'll go to the home. So these are the different classes. So some settings will be in experiment settings, some settings will be in camera settings. Obviously, if you're working with a spectrometer, there'll be in spectrometer settings. So we're going to go to camera settings, and we're going to go to camera settings members. And let's say we don't know what setting we want, and we want to find out what controls the exposure time. Let's control F exposure. So you see here this entry, non-destructive readout. Not really what we're going for here. That's a readout control. These are all non-destructive readout um, methods. Clean before exposure, not quite. Here we go. Shutter timing, exposure time. The duration of time the sensor is exposed to light in milliseconds. So if you want to change exposure time, this is the description that you want. And so we'll go into this field. So you can see this is the camera settings, shutter time, exposure field. And you can see it right there. Camera settings, shutter time, exposure, shutter timing, exposure time, sorry. And it accepts a range of doubles. So you put a double here. So that's the setting. Here's setting, and that's the value. So value will be 20. And now we're going to acquire. So experiment.acquire. You obviously tell what that does, but we're going to go back to this document. You always want to be referring to this manual. Acquire, it's the method in the experiment. We're going to get rid of exists find. Here, acquire. Sorry about that. Acquire, identical to pressing the acquire button from within the LightField application. Okay, so that takes you through this code. Now let's just run it. I'm going to hit F5 and run it, and you'll see what happens. So what's going to happen, it's going to do these declarations. Then once it gets to this line, line 51, it's going to open up a process window for LightField. So it's doing it right now. Just give it a minute to open. And this will be the automation object. That's kind of the core or the foundation of all the automation that you're going to do moving forward. So here, the window opened, and I want to point out a key difference. So let's just let it do its thing. Maximize that. So you can see it already acquired. I have a Pixis 400B X, and it is hooked up to a spectrometer right now with that's on zero order. I have a mercury light source on it, so you can see this zero order line right here. So it did the acquisition. We'll go to common acquisition, so you can see the exposure time is 20 milliseconds, which is exactly what we put there. And what I wanted to show you is you go to your task manager. You'll see that this LightField window is actually an add-in process. So when you open a LightField window, let's just do it. Let's open one more LightField instance. So I'm going to open, this is without automation, I'm going to open the LightField instance. So just give it a minute to do its thing. I'm going to drag it into this window as soon as it's done. Okay. So add in. Here's the regular light field window I just opened. You can see the icon is already different. And here, so I have an add-in process. And now, I'm going to scroll down. The regular light field will be called Princeton Instruments lightfield.exe. So that's how you can distinguish between. And you can see this camera is occupied because I have it open in the um, automation process. So let's get rid of this. So I'll prove it to you kind of here. Search for P, Princeton Instruments light field. Here, let's kill this end task. See, it's going to get rid of the light field window I just opened, but the add-in process is still there. So as you can see, we changed the exposure time. I had a Pixis is the only device hooked up, so when when this line ran, it created the automation object. LightField opened up a process and it automatically loaded that camera in. So because that camera was loaded in, it passed this check where the device was found, and it set the value because exposure time is appropriate on a Pixis, and then it acquired. So we can see the recently acquired file right here, which is the same data that we just saw on the view. So the automation did its thing. So now, what if you're trying to build onto this, or you're trying to debug? Let's say you want let's say you want to change the exposure time back to 100, right? So let's say you add a line here. I'm just going to add a line outside of the if statement. We know the camera's in there, so we're just going to copy this. So we're going to say set value. Now we're going to change this to 100. 0.0 for double if you want, not necessary. But okay, so now you want to change it to 100. What the most common pitfall is, many people would run this entire script again, but that's not what you want to do. The reason for that is once this automation object has been created, again, this is the foundation for everything that goes on forward. This link is already existing to this auto object. So what's going to happen now if you don't dispose of this process by either exiting this process right here, you could kill it through Task Manager, or you can add a dispose command to this auto object. Um, any way you want to do it, but until that's disposed, this is going to stay open, right? So what's going to happen if you run this script again? It's going to do all these declarations. It's going to create another auto object, which is going to launch another automation process. So it's going to create another instance of this add-in process, and that's going to get called auto as well. So now the auto object is going to get overwritten. So now you have the camera open in this instance, but you just created a new instance, and now because you've overwritten that connection, now this auto object is going to be pointing to the second instance, and you're not going to have any way to control this camera anymore. So if you do things like load an experiment and it tries to load the camera that's already opened in another instance, it's going to crash LightField because you can't have the same camera open in multiple instances. So a lot of problems arise because of that. What you want to do is run the script, create the connection, but then when you want to debug or add into that, you're going to want to step through. So to execute this command, you're not going to run the entire script again. You're just going to run this line. So I'm going to select this line. I'm going to press F9 to run the line. You can see this is the only one it ran in the console. You can see exposure time back to 100. Let's do 500. I'm just going to F9. See, ran that line in the console, 500. You're controlling this camera via automation. So that kind of walks you through this code, and that's the most common pitfall when you want to add on to code or debug code. For example, okay, let's say we drag this guy out. We'll take the Pixis out. So now it doesn't have a device in there anymore. So let's run this block. You see, camera not found. Please add a camera and try again, because now this device found isn't true anymore because there's no device in these experiment devices. So that's a walkthrough of the code, how to avoid the most common pitfall. And next we're going to cover how to load a demo camera, a software emulated demo camera, into the automation so that You know, if you're in a situation, for example, where you're working remotely, you don't need a live camera with you to test out um, or to build an automation uh, code. So now we're going to demonstrate how to use a software emulated demo camera, which you can use to do your automation projects remotely or any other way you see fit. So the best way to do this, I'm going to create a LightField window. So this is opening LightField regularly. So I'm out of Python for now. Just imagine we didn't have any automation. We're just opening up LightField. So let it do its thing. Just give it a minute. Open, open. Okay. So the window's here. Gonna maximize that. So it's going to load the application. Because I have that Pixis 400BRX or the 400BX here, it loaded it into the experiment devices. So let me load that out. So I'm going to go here to the right. So you add demo device. So here we have a selection of all of the hardware that LightField 6.11 supports. So for example, let's do a Pixis. We're going to have a Pixis 400BX right here. So we'll create the demo device. You can give it a serial number if you want. That's not important. You can see it created a random serial number. So now this is the software emulated demo camera. So let's load this guy into the experiment. And you can see it has all the settings that the live Pixis would have, like the ADC, the same speeds, the readout modes, region of interest settings, custom sensor options here, and even the shutter controls, trigger in, trigger out. So what does the software emulated camera do? Well, let's say you're gonna acquire some data with it. So I'm just gonna hit F9 to start an acquisition, and you can see this is the software generated data that's coming out of this emulated camera, and you can see it's an array function. So this is just a placeholder. I'm going to stop the preview. Just a placeholder to see to show you that data comes out, and just so you have objects to work with when you program your automation, or you look up things like frame rate um, or any other task you'd want to do if you didn't have a live camera handy, but you need to check something out on the camera. So let's just do a simple acquisition really quick. I'm gonna hit F10. I just acquired an image, and that image, see that's an array function stored out by the by the demo camera. So let's go ahead and save this experiment. I want to hit F4 to save. We'll call it. I'm gonna call it demo exp. It looks like I already had an experiment called that. I'm just gonna overwrite that. So here, demo exp. I'm gonna overwrite that. So now this thing is called demo exp. So when I load demo exp, it's gonna load this software emulated demo camera. So this is gonna be the segue into the automation. This is how we're gonna get this demo camera into the automation by loading an experiment that has the demo camera loaded into the experiment devices. So let's get out of LightField. Let's go back into our spider. This is the exposure acquire sample as is, and or as it is when you install LightField. See, I got rid of that other line I put in here to change the other exposure settings. So what I am going to do now is, so this auto is going to create the automation process. We get the experiment object within the automation object, or the experiment class inside the automation object. So once we have that experiment class, let's go ahead and load in that experiment with the demo camera we just saved. So once again, this document right here. So in the experiment class, I already know that we're going to look for the function load, and you could control F like we did before and go through that, go through the descriptions to see which one would work if you were not sure. So here's the method load. It takes in a string, which is the experiment name, returns a boolean, you know, if it's true, if the load was successful, otherwise false. So this is what we're gonna do. So so we have the experiment object, so we're gonna call that object, and we're gonna do load, and I'm just gonna make a string demo x. That's what I saved it as. So now, no other changes. This thing is gonna run, open the LightField add-in process, create the experiment object. We're gonna load that experiment, and now this exposure time setting is gonna be modified on the demo camera. So let's just run this F5. So just give it a minute. LightField's gonna open. Just give it a minute. It's doing its thing. And again, as you might have noticed when we open that demo camera, the default exposure time is set at 100. So you're going to see immediately it's going to set it to 20 milliseconds and then do an acquisition. So here, application starting. So it's going to load the experiment because we called for it to do just that. See, loading experiment, demo experiment. It's going to do the acquire as we told it to. So it did the acquire. You could see this is the serial number 232 demo that we had loaded. So this is the camera. And you can see the acquisition setting is 20 because we changed it with this. And we look at the acquired file. You can see it's that array function that's from the demo camera. So everything works just like it did on the live camera. And we do the same thing we did before. We just copy this line. Let's put a line here. Let's change that to 500. We're gonna do the here. Just run it at one line in the console. Now it's 500. So you can do everything from changing settings to just testing out different automation workflows. You can do it all with this demo camera. You don't need a live camera on you. Now, obviously, to test the quality of the data, your signal and noise, that type of stuff, you're going to want the live camera. But you could feasibly get an automation workflow running, and then at the end, just plug in an experiment with a live camera loaded instead of the demo camera. So this is the only line you're going to have to change, and you'll be good to go. So that covers the topics that we wanted to get through. So we've introduced the library of reference material and introduced the sample code, showed you how to access this documentation in these sample codes. We've walked through this sample. We've discussed how to avoid the common pitfall of duplicating this automation object and then losing the connection to the camera you had open. And we've demonstrated the use of a software emulated demo camera. So that concludes the demo. So thanks again for watching this demo. I hope it was useful and that you got some pertinent information from this. Please feel free to send us your questions, comments. You can reach us at pi.techsupport@teledyne.com. Once again, I'm Sabir Liaquat at Teledyne Princeton Instruments, and we thank you for watching.